Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am your host, Derek, and today we are actually going to dive right in on Genesis chapter 4, the story of Cain and Abel, and we're gonna skip like an intro to this story like we've done with the previous stories, because really kind of much of the same approach carries over. So it doesn't make sense to necessarily rehash that in terms of the idea of, we're not looking at this as strictly history. We're kind of considering the question of what if it didn't matter whether it happened or not? What's really being told in this story? So we're going to do that here, and we're going to dive right in with the first two verses of chapter 4. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. All right, the first thing to note here, and this becomes important, I guess, on rereads. If you just started reading the Bible and started here, you would not notice this. But of note is the inclusion of Eve, because most of the genealogies down the road, a few here and there, but most of them don't really include mention of the mother, right? And here in these verses, not only is Eve included, Adam is almost an afterthought, right? And Eve is without a doubt the focus of what's occurring right here, which is different when we get to the birth of Seth down the road here, Cain and Abel's younger brother. So I think that's important because what we see relates again to this idea, as we've talked about before through most of chapter 3, of the idea of the masculine and the feminine, right? We've talked about the feminine being this source of like rebirth within us, new offspring, kind of new ways of thinking, approaches to life, all of that. We have the ability to sort of reshape our minds and our approach to things, but we do that through our sort of feminine instinct. So what we see here then is with the two sons, it sets up a sort of dichotomy showing the ends of the spectrum of what the feminine can produce. And we'll get more on that in a moment. But real quick, what do we make of Eve's expression here before we take a look at Cain and Abel a little closer? So this expression here, it's usually portrayed as Eve praising God or crediting God with the birth of her son. And it may look that way, certainly in the English. I think we have a tendency to look at it that way. However, there are a couple of commentators who suggest that quite the opposite is happening here, where she is comparing her achievement with the achievement of God's creation of man. That's interesting. If we look at many of the other times, the word that's being translated here as with the help of the Lord, it seems to mostly translate as being merely with or for or from or through. Those are the typical translations. So if that's the typical translation of this word, and I found very few with the help of, it was mostly just with or for, from, through. To me, then like both approaches seem to go a little too far. Maybe she's not, celebrating God's involvement, or maybe she's not, dismissing it and saying she could do the same thing. It seems like she was just sort of stating something as kind of fact, right? I think we're looking maybe at a statement here as a point of emphasis that she's basically maybe saying that even though she may be the physical source, that new life still comes from God. So not necessarily a celebration of it. I mean, I guess you could still take it that way, but it doesn't seem to be that, because it wasn't like with excitement or with great joy. It's just with. And so that's interesting, because it puts the emphasis of new life on God and coming from God, not the woman, and in kind of just a matter of fact way, right? And that may feel like a diminishment of it to some people, because they would maybe feel like it should be celebrated, and there's a way in which it should be celebrated. But just stating it as fact is very interesting, and I think actually rather significant, especially when it comes to Christians and the abortion discussion, right? Because it sort of states that, like, if it's a way of Eve saying, hey, through me, I mean, what has been translated as through. So God brought forth new life through me. Well, that's interesting, right? Because now it says, what should be done with life is not the decision of the life bearer. The life still belongs to God. It still comes from God. And so, I think that relates, I guess, to the idea of abortion and the whole, choice aspect of things, is because I guess there's some sense of, like, having created that life, you can decide what to do with it. I don't even really know where the justification comes down, because it feels kind of messy. I'm being as friendly to the argument as I can. And yeah, this verse seems to be a stark rejection of that idea. Life comes from God. It doesn't matter what it came through. It comes from God. That's where life comes from. So, all right, moving on to Cain and Abel, which is the next part of this, these verses here. So Cain and Abel are a dichotomy, right? And what we see described here is the dichotomy of something very spiritually based with something very earthy based. I guess the way to think about that is the idea that that rebirth within us, that birth, that we can birth forth new ideas through our feminine perspective, can produce something that is very materially earthy based, or something very spiritually heavenly based. And we'll see in this story, and when we get to it, the idea of that dichotomy being sort of reflected in the qualities of their offerings. We'll also see that what Cain does following his punishment, the earthiness will be emphasized again there. But for here, we see it in two things. We see it represented twice, this idea of the dichotomy of the two, and then we'll remember that going forward in the next few verses. But we see in their names this dichotomy. So the name Abel, that is... The word is thought to be rooted in the idea of either vanity or breath. Breath, of course, we've seen multiple times so far in our study of the Bible here, looking and seeing that as being related to the idea of spirituality, particularly with breathing into Adam. So that seems rather obvious. And even vanity, even if that's where that word is related to, that may well be thought of something as being more ethereal in nature. It's certainly not grounded. Vanity is not something, rooted in earthiness. It's not something material. But vanity, and this is the interesting part of vanity, is it is empty, right? And vanity is there's an emptiness to it. It's not of substance, I guess. And so in Adam, we see a person who is maybe materially a little empty, material emptiness, and breath-like. And looking at that, we can see he represents sort of this spiritual idea of things. Cain, though, that means that the name is related to the idea of sword, smith, or political leader. And those are extremely earthly things, especially by comparison, right? A sword is all about, really, it's really wrapped up well into Cain here, because in a sword we see the idea of earthly power. In a smith we see the idea of reshaping the earthly. And the politics, that is about earthly order, separate from God, separate from spiritual influence. Right? That's really what, when we get down to it, politics and these things are about people ordering themselves without the influence of God directly in that process, let's say. So We see there that dichotomy presented, and we also see it here in their occupations, which is presented, right? In Abel, we see a shepherd, right? And the shepherd, we often see that, of course, later come to parallel the idea of spiritual leadership, right? But it's an oversight of life. That is what a shepherd does. A shepherd deals with life, deals with the animals. Particular subset of animals, but that's the idea, is an overseer of animals. Animals, of course, live. And that is something that if you're going to oversee life is dependent upon spiritual insight, right? That's why the shepherd is paralleled so much with spiritual leadership, is because to understand life, you need to be connected with the source of life, God. Where did that come from? That is how you can properly oversee it. Cain works the ground, right? And so obviously, if you're working the ground, bringing forth plants and whatnot from that, you're obviously rooted in the earthly side of things. That's what plants are. They're rooted there. And realistically speaking, I mean, you can do it better if you have spiritual insight, but the idea is, well, you're dealing with the earthly things. You can shape the world without needing spiritual insight. That would be an idea that you could see wrapped into that. So what we see here is two totally separate sides of the spectrum of the kinds of perspectives that the feminine instinct within us might produce when we're birthing new perspectives within ourselves, birthing new understandings and approaches to the world. We can come from one of these two ends, or somewhere between these two ends. Let's put it that way. So on one side we have the totally spiritual of Abel, who though lacks kind of the earthly insight. And then we have the earthiness of Cain, who lacks the spiritual insight. And so, real quick, I guess I should clarify why I say Abel lacks earthly insight is this idea of, we'll see it almost in his sort of naivete with his brother, and that we don't even get, level of self-defense or anything like that discussed. He seems in the story, as we barely hear him speak, he is guiding only life, right? He's not at all involved in the land, anything like that. He's guiding only life, and so thus wouldn't have insight to the earthly. Cain is dealing only with the earthly, not anything with the life, and so he lacks any of the spiritual insight. So the message of this story, as we'll see, is actually that neither ideal, neither end of the spectrum is best, particularly in a world of sin, right? As one proves to be a threat to the other. And as humans, we're made to sort of be in between, part spiritual, part earthy. And so either end of the spectrum is kind of a problem. And so there's a reason when we look at these two that neither are described as the image of Adam, who is the image of God, who we will later see that description is given to Seth, the third brother in all of this. And so that is what we're meant to be. We're not meant to be, all earthly based, and we sort of understand that as Christians very instinctually. But we're also not meant to be all like purely spiritual based, right? Sort of the, we've had, Gnostic ideas and those kind of things where there's sort of like a rejection of the flesh and the rejection of who we are. And that's taken from some ideas from Paul. And yes, the flesh is corrupted, but it doesn't mean that's not who we're meant to be. And that's important to recognize. We're meant to be part dust, part God-breathed, like Adam. That's what we're meant to be. Doesn't mean we have to be guided by the flesh, but we have to inhabit it. And in Cain and Abel, we see just the inhabiting of each end of the spectrum. So that's a key concept we want to think about as we move forward with the rest of these particular verses, and then continuing on from there, actually, even. So, and we'll look more at the next verse or two. I can't remember how many I set up for the next episode, but we'll look at those when we get to them next time. Be sure to like, subscribe, review, all of those things. Shoot me an email on schooltheology@protonmail.com, and we'll catch you again next time. Thanks.